Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Sarah. I'm the curator here at Lake George Historical Association. Today we are welcoming Amy Godine, writer, journalist, and scholar, author of The Black Woods. Today she'll be expanding on the topic of her book, The Black Woods, of which she has many copies available over to the side of us here. And please join me in welcoming Amy.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for turning out on this nice day. I appreciate it. I'm going to read my talk because, as those of you of a certain age know, at a certain point you just can't trust yourself to get to everything you want to if you just wing it. So I'm not winging it these days. I'm going to talk and try not to read too obviously. I'm not going to talk mostly about the Black Woods, though I'll certainly allude to it, and the book is there for you to look at and buy if you want after. I'm going to talk about the racialized Adirondacks, which includes that story, but is more broad than it. And I think it'll be more, some of you have already read the book, and I think this will be more interesting for you, which it was more interesting for me to do, because I've talked about the Black Woods so many times, honestly, it's nice not to sometimes, so. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm guessing that some of you here who are from here might recall an incident a couple of years ago, a couple of incidents that troubled the Adirondack region when students at SUNY Potsdam were in a video wearing blackface. It was a spate of racist incidents, and the African American then president of the Sierra Club, Aaron Mayer, was harassed when he was kayaking down a river, or he was fishing on the side and kayakers hurled racial epithets at him. A black summer camp instructor was hit with more of the same when he came into Ticonderoga to go to the Walmart, more racist vitriol. And then again in a tavern here in Lake George. This was a bad summer. It's about, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago maybe. The biosphere was electrified by these reports. Does anyone remember this stuff when it all came shaking down? And with the distressed responses of Adirondackers who recognized the need to out these incidents and condemn them and do what needed to happen to ensure this region is a safe, welcoming, and inclusive place for one and all. The problem, it's often noted, is that Black visitors don't feel very comfortable up in this region. It's so white inside the blue line. People of color report feeling like curiosities when they come here. It's not that the attention is hostile. It's the fact that attention gets paid in the first place, that they are seen and judged, however cordially, as anomalies, outsiders. The good news is that many environmentalists and activists have taken on the challenge of Adirondack racism. I wish I'd brought my glasses because I'm blurring a little bit. Jack, if you see my bag, oh, really? Bless you. Thank you.
I don't know if it worked. Let me know.
I will. Oh, this is great. Wow. We'll see how this works. We'll see. So far, so good. Okay. Yeah. The good news is that it's so much better. Thank you. Is that many Adirondack environmentalists and activists have taken on the challenge of Adirondack racism and are advocating for more culturally sensitive hospitality and working hard to market the Adirondacks to a racially diverse clientele. And I think this is swell. We all do. I'm all for a more inclusive Adirondack Park, and I can even buy the math that drives this passionate good work. In a generation or so, as the environmentalist Pete Nilsson observed some years ago in the Adirondack Almanac, the majority of New Yorkers will be non-white, and New York's electorate will be dominated by non-white voters. Historically, this voting bloc has not had much acquaintance with the Adirondack Park. It doesn't know its history or its mission, and doesn't see how it's different from any other big national park, doesn't recognize its assets. And this will be a problem if the preponderance of New York voters know little of the park and feel no investment in it. It will feel little responsibility to its survival, and legislation won't tip in the park's favor. The influence of the pro-park lobby will be diminished, funding stripped, pro-park initiatives dismantled. So how to preempt and diffuse this challenge? Diversity advocates have called for ramping up marketing and organizing initiatives to get more people of color inside the Blue Line, more teens on camping trips, more tourists to the towns, more client-friendly merchandising, Black hair and beauty products at the CVS, for instance, or group package deals at hotels for bus tours, or Black heritage tourism might help to assure Black visitors they have a place here. And urging, incentivizing Black Americans to move here, claim this country as their own. This too would be good for visitors of color and for the park's political and environmental prospects. But here's the trouble with these fixes. Yes, of course, a more racially and ethnically diverse Adirondacks is a noble goal, but this is not a numbers game. It never has been. It goes deeper. The fact is, the Adirondacks has been a racialized terrain long before the forest preserve and the park itself were organized. It was racialized from the first days of the European settlement. And unpacking this heavy legacy is a bigger job than getting Jerry Curl into the Lake George Rite Aid or organizing camping trips for kids of color. It means revisiting not only how we think about the park, but thinking about what it stood for at its founding and how the process of racialization informed its promotion and its brand. And it means asking a tough question. Can a racialized landscape 200 or 300 years in the making be amended when it's so entrenched? Let's consider briefly the role of race in Adirondack history. Next to the great parks out west, this parkland had it very easy. No forced removals were imposed to dislodge Native peoples here as they were driven from ancestral homes in Yosemite, Yellowstone, and Glacier between the 1870s and the 1930s. Native people in this region, who had been coming here for many thousands of years, foraging and fishing, trapping and hunting, littering the land with the arrowheads that stock our town museums, and lacing the deep woods with trails, didn't settle here year-round. And because their sojourns were merely seasonal, their claim on historical attention has been weak. But right there is evidence of an Anglo-centric bias that privileges one group over another. The emphasis on settlement as a measure of investiture, legitimacy, and the dismissal of a culture that did not share this same relationship to land was not an assault on the order of the physical removal of Indians out west, but it was a scrubbing all the same, purging the record that cleared the way to claim the region as the right and due domain of year-round landowners, white people. Of course, not all whites were equal, and some whites for a long while were not considered white at all. French Canadians, the first Europeans in the region, bore the burden of Anglo-centric racist caricature from the first days of the Republic and of more aggressive assaults in 20th century Vermont, where eugenicists scoured French-descended enclaves for so-called defectives and targeted them for sterilization. The seeming failure of Franco-Americans to properly assimilate was seen as evidence of their slowness, but really it was a function of their proximity to Quebec, their homeland of 3 centuries. The nearness of the mother country, the access to a homeland no other immigrant group enjoyed, took the urgency out of the effort to Americanize and roused nativist suspicions about the Franco-American split loyalties. What were they anyway, Americans or Quebecois? Many European immigrants felt the same fierce devotion to faith, language, and ancestral home as the French, but no group was so well positioned to sustain the old country ties as the French were. Which advantage would win them no points or favors in Adirondack town and county histories? In Anglo-America, not owning, as we have seen, meant not counting, and poor Franco-American families would not count for much. in local records. Skip back now to the first generations of European Protestants in the region, whose descendants we now generically describe as WASPs. But this one-size-all acronym would once have violently offended the Congregationalist homesteader in Tupper Lake, the Quaker merchant in Peru, or the Dutch Reformed farmer in Vales Mills, who each held each other in suspicion and contempt and acknowledged a cultural chasm between their sects that verged on the racial. What had the Scots Highlander, still speaking Gaelic when he got here in the early 1700s, in common with the despised English-descended, New England-nurtured Yankee? Even into the 18th century, the Adirondack Scotsman and the Yankee essentialized each other's differences. The Yankee, to the Scotsman, was a sharp trader, a chiseler, and a cheat. The Scot, French from the Highlands, was a savage and a rumored cannibal. They gave each other a wide berth. Then came the mid-19th century famine-driven flood of Irish Catholics, an influx that furnished all these embattled Protestant sects with a new enemy outside their ranks and the prospect of a unitary racialized identity, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Against the surging Celtic hordes, Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian alike joined ranks as whites fled to, as they joined ranks as whites, to save the fragile republic from the surging papist menace. Nativist propaganda warned of Irish mobism, superstition, and intransigence. These qualities were essentialized. This was their lesser race, their base, degraded nature. Caricatures pictured the immigrant Irish as simian and brutish. Jews, too, comprised a race unto themselves with familiar characteristics, cringing, mercenary, sly, and clannish. Slavs were slow and lumpen, ineducable, thuggish. Italians, childlike, temperamental, primitive, prone to fits of violence. These qualities were not environmentally or circumstantially determined. They expressed a racial destiny. And they were qualities, it was increasingly asserted, that would dominate and degrade the superior Anglo-Saxon germplasm if they were not held in check. The fact that most of these now all whited up groups assimilated within 2 or 3 generations of their arrival has blurred our understanding of the rampant racism behind the bigotry. We know some immigrant groups came in for a hard time, but these were white people after all, and victims of racism were brown and black. But now we should know better. For 30 years, science has assured us that ideas of race are changeable and fluid and have no hard and fast genetic meaning. Race is a social construct, a cultural invention. Noel Ignatieff tracks the process of the Irish whitening up in his influential study, How the Irish Became White. Has anyone read that? Oh, it's a great book. You should get it. They did it, he explains, by scrupulously cultivating alliances with Democratic Tammany in New York City, a political organization that hastened Irish enfranchisement and let the immigrants underscore their difference from disenfranchised black people. In the Adirondack region, the process was perhaps less political, but here too, it was the presence of other dark-complected groups that let the Irish clamber up the ladder into whiteness, their brogues tamed, their status buoyed from laborer to landowner, from mucker to mine super, each step gaining them more distance from the racial other down below, like newer arrived Hungarians, Spaniards, Italians, Eastern European Jews. Especially when they were manual laborers, these groups fared particularly poorly in the annals of Adirondack written history, and again, for reasons that invoke the fate of Native Americans. Thousands of Italians sojourned in the Adirondacks, for example, rolling in from Utica, Glens Falls, and Watertown to line track, build dams, widen roads, and make the great bouldered manorial hearths and chimneys for various great camps and hotels. But because their Adirondack stays were seasonal, their experience invited virtually no notice. Same has happened with the Native Americans. Here seasonally, so they don't show up in the records. And if they were noticed, their story was misrepresented, misconstrued. Let's recall that Italy was only unified under one flag in 1861. Only 10% of the population spoke Italian then, I mean in Italy itself. And for generations after unification, Italians identified themselves not with a new paper nation, but with their home region or city, Sicily, Calabria, Puglia. Americans knew these new arrivals by the modern names of nation-states that held little meaning for the immigrants themselves. But nobody was writing about this. The immigrant laborers themselves were illiterate. Their Adirondack experience would not find its way to paper, nor was it represented in material culture. Hamilton County families like the Morehouses and Plumneys, Fishes, Spires, Wellses, Gilmans, and Tefts left monuments to keep their names alive and work, their names and work alive in Adirondack memory. Towns took their names in streets, parks, dams, cemeteries. They built the homes of heavy brick and granite that show up on historic registers. And encoded in these leavings is a boosterish, coherent narrative of material achievement and endurance. But the homes of the Adirondack rural and industrial poor were never made to last. Class matters, and the cultural geography of an impoverished squatter or lineman in the woods is faint. Place names in local memory can glimpse an ethnic presence that rarely finds its way onto a printed map. Many of you have heard of Timbuktu, the mid-century black farm colony in North Elba, near Lake Placid, whose pioneers were friends of the abolitionist John Brown. But you won't find it on any map, not Timbuktu, or Blacksville, or Freeman's Home, or any of the black neighborhoods engendered by the abolitionist reformer Garrett Smith's vast gifts of Adirondack land to black New Yorkers in 1846 and 1847. You won't find any of the Adirondack ponds, hills, creeks, or roads that were prefaced by the N-word on any map. Derogatory place names were banished and replaced by federal decree in 1962. In the mining district of Mariah in Essex County, 8 out of 10 of Witherby and Sherman's workers were foreign-born in 1912. That's a lot of people. But the Spanish settlement, the Italian and Hungarian boarding houses are gone. Not much to look at either in what is left of Polander Hill in Lion Mountain, or Dublin outside Chestertown, or Irish Hill in Upper Jay, or Little Canada in Indian Lake. And I think there was a Little Canada here. Am I right? Does it ring a bell? Someone will tell me. In 2001, I curated an exhibit, Dreaming of Timbuktu, for the Adirondack Museum, which you can still see at the John Brown Farm in North Elba, where it's permanently installed in the barn. It opened at the museum at the same time as a terrific exhibition on Teddy Roosevelt's Adirondacks. And the difference between the two shows struck me very hard at the time. And I was jealous. Roosevelt's exhibit fairly glittered with great bling. Books and binocs, sketchbooks, guns, fine fishing gear, and camp chairs. What a load of great stuff. Our exhibit was, still is, all talking walls with hardly any stuff at all. We never found a photograph, drawing, or description of one of Garrett Smith's black grantees' rough-built cabins, barns, or ice houses. We thought we had a photograph of some grantees' descendants in a field in North Elba, but a spoil sport at the Adirondack Museum determined it was taken in South Carolina, so we had to give up our one picture. Our one picture no longer worked. Not one image survives of a black grantee farming on his land, a farm wife on her porch, their children in a yard. Everything had tumbled back into the woods. So it goes with the material culture of rural poverty. Wood rots, joists collapse, fences buckle, a poor man's headstone, a carved board, splinters and decays. The only stuff we had in the Timbuktu exhibit belonged to white people of means. John Brown's surveying chain, Garrett Smith's custom-made writing chair. The Roosevelt exhibit abounded with fine goods of quality because the family had the bucks to buy them. This was not an option for the black farmers, French lumberjacks, or Irish river drivers. Posterity was not their object. Good health, a little cash, a good night's sleep would need to be enough. And even when the houses in immigrant communities survive, the way they look, their material profile, reveal little of their ethnic roots. The Chinese jail in Port Henry held over 700 boys and men, mostly Chinese, over a decade in the 1900s. They were on their way from Canada to New York City. The local sheriff routinely rounded up the Celestials, as they were called, and held them in a special Chinese detention center, one of 3 such segregated jails for Chinese illegals in the North Country. The others were in Plattsburgh and Malone. It is sort of an amazing story and an integral one in Adirondack history, the story of illegal aliens slipping south from Canada and the smugglers who oversaw their passage. But there was no way to read the story on the land. The Chinese jail itself was an undistinguished clapboard tenement house, nothing Cantonese about it. No clue lurking in the houses along Port Henry's Elizabeth Street that says this was a vibrant enclave of black miners and Italians. Migrant and immigrant laborers inherited their modest housing from earlier generations of Yankee builders. They did not reinvent their tenements or farmhouses in the image of the shtetl or the Italian hill town. So nothing Spanish looking about the 3 stores in Witherby that carried La Prensa and Marzapone and chorizo, and nothing Celtic about the Ryans' white clapboard farmhouse. Maybe an industrial archaeologist could read Italian features into the bake oven near an old line of railroad track, but for most of us, it's a heap of rubble. In the forest, the sunken square of an old cellar hole assures us someone lived here, but it can't tell us in what tongue the occupant said his prayers. I'm not saying the landscape is wholly stripped of clues that can help us call the immigrant experience to bright, distinctive life. Adirondack churches will show a French-Canadian roofline or an English imprint in the facades of Federal and Greek Revival-style churches in Ironville, Putnam, Northville, and Crown Point, and probably this town too. The large spires and proudly prominent siting of our older Catholic churches express the welcome sense of liberation from the despised penal laws of England's Parliament, which for so long curtailed the size and use of Catholic steeples, crosses, and bells. In church structures, if we know what to look for, we can track an ethnic patrimony. And in cemeteries, the cedars of Lebanon on the immigrants' headstones in Tupper Lake, the Hebrew lettering on the graves of Jews, the fleur-de-lis for French Canadians, they all hint at the range and richness of the immigrant legacy in the North Country. The coming of the Irish in the 1940s, the loosening of the floodgates in the 1880s, and tragedies as well. A deadly epidemic that wiped out entire families in Irish town outside Minerva, 1 family, 7 names inside a week. Here, evidence of the immigrants' frontier ordeal is etched in lasting stone. But there were groups that left no clues at all, never settled or were buried here, never aspired to assimilate or gain a public voice, never put their children through the democratizing clothes wringer of local schools or military service. Gypsies, who Adirondack newspapers start noticing as early as the 1870s, remain entirely elusive. In Hamilton County, they touch down in Wells, Speculator, and Tupper Lake, telling fortunes, trading horses, and whipping up anxiety about chicken thieves and pickpockets before they even got to town. "Take in your clothesline and harvest your eatables," wrote an editor in 1881. In 1922, 65 Portuguese gypsies, quote, "swooped down" on Plattsburgh en route to Coney Island. That same summer, Tupper Lake assumed, quote, "all the earmarks of a Wild West town," when 50 gypsies from Brazil, garbed in gaudy hue, caravanned in beat-up cars down Maine. But for all the hoopla in the small-town press, gypsies were never interviewed and left no carte de visite where they touched down. So their side of things we never heard. Chinese, too, nothing gives us their perspective. Tramps and hobos so prolific in the region during our national depressions, were reviled in local papers, but nothing tells us how they registered our barns, meadows, and small-town jails. Hired hands, every farmhouse had them, remain invisible, unremarked. Xenophobia, the intense, unreasonable fear of foreigners or strangers, was a proud, enduring Adirondack tradition and easily indulged when the stranger had no voice. A big chunk of the story, the experience of Adirondack sojourners from their perspective, was consigned to the dark side of the moon. How did this come to pass? I've offered a few reasons. How rapidly some groups were able to assimilate and whiten up. The reluctance or simple inability of immigrants to commit their experience to paper. A vestigial material culture too drab and undistinguished to invite preservation or inquiry. But there's another reason for this missing understory I'd like now to explore. I don't believe it simply fell away. I think it had a lot of help. I think it was unwelcome. In fact, I think it can be shown that the history of the ethnic and non-white Adirondacks was minimized on purpose. And as I said at the start, this was a process that started long ago. Quote, thanks to the settlers of Essex County of New England origin, the Adirondack historian Winslow Watson claimed in 1853, quote, no county of the state embraced a population of higher intelligence, of pure morality, of more industrious and frugal habits. 7 years later, gushing odes and essays about the Puritan-rooted, undefiled Yankee roots of Adirondack country exalted the death and burial of the radical abolitionist John Brown. An emerging genre of travel literature pitched not at land speculators or industrialists, but at an emerging city-weary leisure class, valorized a wilderness that promised not only rest and recreation, but physical and spiritual regeneration, and an accessible wilderness as well, thanks to rail, steam, and stagecoach service, but not so accessible that anyone could reach it. It took money to enjoy the Adirondacks as a tourist, excursionist, or sportsman. Money for the transport, for the weeks away from work, for the gear, guns, rods, reel and creel, couture, and for the guide. A common laborer could not afford this. An immigrant, no way. And this was not a neutral feature of the experience. It was a positive good. From the first days of its development, the recreational Adirondacks was an economically exclusive and exclusionary landscape, a proving ground for the exertion of white privilege and power, and a refuge, an escape. From what exactly? Well, cities, obviously, with everything that wrecked them. Congestion, noise, befouled air, consumptives, drunks, filth, and evidence of poverty, drunkenness, malnutrition, and disease. But also people who looked alien and nothing like themselves. First of all, poor Southern blacks, such an unnerving influx of them since the Civil War, and raising everywhere the threat, the risk of miscegenation and a defilement of the race. And immigrants as raucous, driven and prolific as an army. Were they an army? Was the United States being invaded by the darker, shorter, lesser tribes? Some folks worried. And what were the implications here for the survival of American identity and character? The convergence of the peak era of European immigration to this country, 1880 to 1924, and the boom decades of eugenics, the pseudoscience that aimed at improving the genetic quality of the human population through anti-immigration laws, compulsory sterilization, anti-miscegenation rulings, and institutionalization, was no fluke. In the 1880s, long-standing post-Civil War anxieties among native-born Americans about cultural and racial degradation were boiling to a head. Jostling throngs of immigrants, warned the leading eugenicist ideologue and author Madison Grant, drawn from, quote, the weak, the broken, and the mentally crippled of all races, end quote, were invading North America with all the rapacity lesser races had visited on ancient Greece and imperial Rome. The solution? stop them, segregate them, deport or sterilize them, or lesser races would assuredly prevail. Cross a purebred Nordic specimen with an African, Native American, Hispanic, Jew, or any other lower type, and the more primitive and brutish race would invariably overwhelm the more refined, less brutish Nordic germplasm. Our nation would be worse than defiled. It would be mongrelized. And old stock Americans, Homo europaeus, I don't know, someone will tell me later, the white man par excellence, would soon be rare and little seen, as rare and little seen as the imperiled native Adirondack moose. This is not my metaphor. It's one of the eugenicists. And in Madison Grant's and others' words, we can begin to trace the affinities between the principles of environmental conservation and the new eugenics program that was emerging at the time. Both progressive movements were dedicated to the efficient husbandry of native resources, from the Adirondack wilderness to our best genetic germ stock. And both movements were driven by the shared fear of contagion, of admixture, of pollution, and conversely, a cultish pursuit of purity. Advocates of the Adirondack Forest Preserve and the Adirondack Park and spokesmen for Adirondack sportsmen's clubs and great camps and preserves shared these concerns as well and were powerfully compelled by the eugenicist agenda. After all, the watchword of progressivism was efficiency, and melding the two passions, conservation and race betterment, just seemed to make such sense. The threat to Anglo-Saxon purity posed by the arrival of some 25 million people in just 40 years' time seemed to neatly parallel the raging threat to to Native American wildlife and flora. Little wonder, really, that in 1910, the president of the Daughters of the American Revolution would declare, "We, the mothers of this generation, ancestresses of future generations, have a right to insist upon the conserving of not only our soil, our forest, birds, minerals, fishes, waterways, in the interest of forest future homemakers, but also upon the conservation of the Caucasian race in our land." This, then, is the wider context we need to keep in mind when, say, we read a headline in an Adirondack paper in 1910 about an Italian miner who got arrested in Maria for shooting songbirds for his table. For the reader and the writer in that age, this wasn't a petty crime. This was an assault on our native patrimony by an interloper so dangerous, so grim, the conservationist William Hornaday, who wrote the bestseller Our Vanishing Wildlife, and the head of the Bronx Zoo, actually likened him, the shooter, to an invasive. Writing about Italians in forest and stream, he declared, "They are pouring into America in a steady stream. They are strong, prolific, persistent, and of tireless energy. They work while the Native Americans sleep. Wherever they settle, their tendency is to root out the Native American and take his place and his income. Toward wildlife, the Italian is a human mongoose. Give him power to act, and he will quickly exterminate every wild thing that wears feathers or hair. To our songbirds, he is literally a pestilence that walketh at noonday," and so on. So much more was at stake here than a meadowlark. That bird and all things wild stood for all things native, pure, and undefended. To shoot a songbird for the pot, the origin of the word potshot, incidentally, revealed a neediness and desperation that had no place in our good woods. Market shooters and pot hunters were more than low-born. They were uncivilized, unevolved, and would not change. This was a given. Against not just one trigger-happy immigrant, but this whole predatory species, the Adirondacks had to be protected. For the songbird's sake, but also for the Adirondack watershed. The native woodlands, the balsam-scented, ozone-laden, healing Adirondack air, the clarifying cold, the uninterrupted viewshed, each of these an icon of purity, to which would be annealed a human purity as well, namely the integrity of an undefiled Anglo society. It was all part of the same bounty, the same endangered world. And the Adirondack Hunting Club and Private Preserve and Colony were more than defenders of this world. They stood for it. They were its face. For all the ranging differences between these clubs and great camps and compounds, wrote the Adirondack Park historian Barbara McMartin, this was the single thing they had devotedly in common, the right to insist on social exclusivity, on the purity of their white worlds. Well, she never mentioned race, but I am. Race was not her interest. The early hunters' clubs and fishing clubs that cleared the way for the formation of the park did much more for conservation than keep their streams and lakes well supplied with noble game fish. Brook trout were known as the aristocrat of their race. They matched those brookies with their human equivalents, stocked their memberships with well-to-do white Protestants bound firmly by a web of social, family, school, church, boardroom, and city club allegiances. An elite that in the immigrant metropolis felt itself imperiled was, inside the blue line, dominant and strong. Nobody was here that didn't make the cut. There was a way to fish and a way to hunt, and while money mattered, because your gear and guide and sportsy couture and weeks away from home were costly, only class and breeding could ensure you knew the difference between the pot hunter, the man who hunted for his table, and the gentleman who fished and tracked and hunted sheerly for sport. It was the difference between the predator, the lowbred, the degraded, and the man of chivalry and conscience, the steward, the protector, whose culture represented the traditions of the English aristocracy. This association was as unassailable as race. You would be square dealing and respectful with your guide, but he could never be your intimate or equal. And this too was part of the delicious purity of your Adirondack experience, knowing that up here, for at least a few fine weeks, the hierarchies that distinguish the gentleman from the commoner, the true white man from the rest, would be honored. In 1893, 1/4 of the new Adirondack Park, a total of 940,000 acres, was leased or owned by 50 private sportsmen's clubs. Within 30 years, these middle-class white-topias were joined by all the other exclusionary social enclaves that would give the park a more notably patrician tone. Great camps, grand preserves, residential colonies like the Lake Placid Club, biggest four-season colony of its kind in the nation, the elite summer camps and lakeside multifamily compounds, country clubs, lake associations, etc. All were asked and expected to defend the conservationist principles that undergirded the park itself. And I'm going to venture a good guess that nearly all of them represented a culture of exclusion, class bias, and racism. State lands, of course, were different, public and open to one and all, or one and all who could afford to get up here and make the journey worth their while, a caveat that excluded many millions, but the geography was no one's fault. More interesting are the choices made that revealed the park's ease and affinity with the private mini-parks in its midst. Early on, the Forest Commission might have bought that near million acres of clubland and made it all part of the park. This land, the State Fish and Game Commissioner observed in 1893, was more than fine, it was the best. The heart of the region, so to speak, has been cut out and appropriated by private interests. He told Forest and Stream, with few exceptions, all the best and desirable lands and waters are potentially closed to the public. Its purchase might have argued for its eventual access for a much wider and diverse demographic than a select non-resident few. But why spend the taxpayers' money when the clubs themselves had promised to steward and patrol their land at no cost to the state? And why, this reason left implicit, but obvious all the same, reward the undeserving? The park and the many private parks within it stood for progress, management, and order. The woodsmen, poachers, hunters sniffing around the gates were mess makers and despoilers. It was the chopper and the railroad hog's abandoned campfire in the woods that fired up the inferno, the trapper's greed and nets that put native wildlife at risk. It was his wife's and daughters' imperfect housekeeping that disappointed tourists' expectations for how this country ought to look. A frequent complaint that excursionists made when they took trains through the Adirondacks was how untidy the local cabins were that they saw through the woods. Emerging hierarchies of the deserving and the unworthy would judge any poor Adirondacker who fished or hunted not for sport but for his family as an archaism, an unenlightened remnant of a savage, outgrown era. Could such a relic be trusted to steward a new Central Park for the world, as the Adirondack Park would be known? As early as the 1870s, squatters who once owned a proud name in local history as bold frontiersmen had begun to figure as lawless, careless, undeserving misfits, or to borrow Harriet Beecher Stowe's enduring name for impoverished Southern whites, white trash. Not just state policies, but the court of mainstream public opinion, local historians, town reporters, magazine writers, marginalized this Adirondack underclass with ethnic stereotypes and comic anecdotes that underscored who fit here and who didn't. How many scores of Adirondack newspaper columns have I read that extolled the antics of a loyal dog or kitten named N-word? How many blackface shows in Adirondack opera halls reinforced white supremacist cliches? Pondering the othering of Adirondack blacks in historian Alfred Donaldson's merry take on Timbuktu, in 1922, he wrote, "The attempt to combine an escaped slave with a so-called Adirondack farm was about as promising of agricultural results as would be the placing of an Italian lizard on a Norwegian iceberg." Where these non-elites aren't simply absent from the shelves of Adirondackana, and by this I mean the heavy canon of Adirondack antiquarian history books, biographies, travelogues, memoirs of the great camps, old pioneer days, the first years of the preserve and park. Their bit parts, the parts of the non-elites, are contrived to underscore their differences, their manifest unsuitability for Adirondack life. The pig-tailed celestials in the segregated jails in Malone, Plattsburgh, or Port Henry. The jolly French-Canadian logger on his payday bender. The now you see it, now you don't, gypsy camp at the edge of town. The knife fight ready Italian mucker. In 1931, Adirondack New York State historian Alexander Flick declared with confident authority that, quote, "In few other portions of the United States has there been less infusion of foreign blood." A strange assertion when by this decade, the Adirondack region had absorbed immigrant laborers by the thousands. In Redford, Keysville, Whitehall, and Saranac Lake, French Canadians were numerous enough to sustain French Catholic churches and French schools. Numbers of Irish Catholics in the region were great enough to provoke the Ku Klux Klan to torch its crosses on a dozen Adirondack hills during the campaigns of the downstate Irish Democratic Pole Al Smith. In 1915, almost 30 Spaniards, mostly temporarily laid-off miners, labored on the road from West Hague to Horicon, along with 12 Portuguese and 43 Italians. That same year, a third of the immigrants working on the state road from Hague to Chester were Spanish. By 1920, 120 Spaniards were in the mines, a hiring surge triggered by the industrial needs of the First World War. By 1930, Eastern European and Lebanese Syrian peddlers had expanded their first dusty storefronts into the department stores that anchored main streets in Port Henry, Chestertown, North Creek, Lake Placid, Ticonderoga, and I'm thinking maybe Lake Placid too. I'm not sure if I'm remembering that right. French Canadians continued to stream south for the logging season. When it came, Russian refugees had discovered the logging camps as well, and black Southerners were now waiting tables and staffing kitchens in lakeside resorts in Lake Placid and Loon Lake. And all this hot activity long before Flick declared the Adirondacks a bastion of Yankee purity. But what matters about Flick's remark is not that it's distorted, it's what it reveals about the Adirondack brand. His exalted vision of an exceptionalist terrain hinged on the reassurance of the absence of diversity and the lesser narratives of French Canadians and Indians, Italian laborers, and white trash were filtered out like some gross contaminant. This is the bleak side of the Adirondack narrative, its roots in a culture invested quite as much as keeping certain kinds of people out of the viewfinder as waving others in. The implication of a linkage between the pristine germplasm of white Anglo-Saxon rootstock, these phrases are gone to us now, but they were stock and trade back in the 20s, and the vaunted purity of Adirondack nature was part of what made the pitch for the preserve and park so winning to its advocates and promoters. It naturalized their elitism. It emboldened their rationale for cordoning off a near 1 million acres of prime wilderness land. And the proliferation of no trespassing signs was just the beginning of the exclusionary trend. Other strategies that helped secure and purify this landscape were the restrictive covenants and bylaws of residential colonies, summer camps and clubs, which ranged from the coded to the crudely explicit, town ordinances that outlawed peddlers, a shot at Syrians and Jews. In the 1920s, as Black Americans gained the means to tour and travel, a de facto culture of Jim Crow that made booking hotel rooms an annual ordeal for Black pilgrims who came to Lake Placid every spring to celebrate John Brown's birthday in North Elba. In her short book, Playing in the Dark, the novelist Toni Morrison makes the point that authors don't have to write about brown, black, or yellow people to produce profoundly racialized narratives. The number of Black characters on the page isn't the point. The deeper thing is the imaging, the language, the guiding metaphors, and how they work. Morrison was writing about classic American literature, Melville, James, Hemingway, and Cather. But I think we might apply this point to history, and the insight would still hold. What ails the Adirondacks isn't a dearth of Black tourists or Black residents. It's what race or racial difference has signified for our idea of this place from the first days of the Anglo-European settlement. It's how the false trope of purity has racialized the history and the landscape both, and othered the undeserving, the unfit, for memory. I don't have any bright ideas on how to remedy or change this. I just want to observe that race is bigger than a head count in our region. Othering is a habit that impairs our vision still. We still don't think of sojourners in our region as deserving members of the Adirondack community. Apple pickers from Florida and Jamaica, who've been coming to the Champlain Valley now for generations, foreign seasonal workers from Peru, at our hotel desks and ski lifts and amusement parks, inmates in our several prisons, many of them men of color from downstate, immigrant arrivals like the Punjabi Sikhs who manage service stations along the Northway, or Chinese families in the storefront restaurants from Lake Placid to Northville to Thai. Every time we look at one of these and think casually, man, how weird to see one of you here. How out of place you seem. We racialize the Adirondacks and buy into an obsolete, exclusionary brand with roots in 19th century white supremacism. And we racialize it too when we talk about selling the park to a more diverse population without considering the need for kinds of changes that offer more than Black hair products or summer outings for kids. What could these changes mean? I'm no strategist or planner, but I do think wistfully today of visionaries like Robert Marshall, an Adirondacker, founder of the Wilderness Society, and a socialist who dreamed of stepping up diversity through better, cheaper public access, like subsidized excursion trains or affordable housing, backwoods hostels in the European style for students and low-income hikers and campers. Not saying any of these are solutions, but at least Marshall was thinking big or outside the box. Maybe now is the time for big thinking revisionist ideas like these. Maybe the time has come for those. In any case, my time has come, and likely yours as well. So I hope this got you dreaming and scheming a little, and I hope you have some questions for me, because that would be nice. Thanks. Anybody? Yeah.
You actually try to mic your questions.
Oh, good.
I got it, Tony.
Okay. One way to help might be to establish the historical foundations of a more diverse Adirondack. So I've been thinking about all of the letters home that most families have in their attics or trunks, and some of them probably afford great insights into what it was like to be poor in the Adirondacks, to be going from one place to another, to work on a highway or wherever work was available. And I don't know of any collection or library that would be interested in those, though I think they should be. And I'm wondering if in your, for instance, relationships with the, what is it they call the Adirondack Museum now, Adirondack Experience, whether or not you found any openness to a wider view of what's worth preserving.
Oh, that's a great question, and it comes back to the problem of literacy and the lack of it. What do you do with an immigrant generation that isn't literate in this language, or maybe its own, and isn't writing because the writing skills or material isn't there, or writing isn't valorized in that culture? The closest I've come to documenting the immigrant experience is not very close. It's through the columns of employees that bosses kept for the mines, say, or for tanneries or so forth. You can at least see who's working there. It's what boarding houses name in their lists of patrons, if those are kept at the Adirondack History Museum, for instance. Censuses are always a huge clue, but they just go so far and then you hit a wall. Church records are probably good. I haven't examined those, and they're probably consolidated now in centralized archives, is my guess, in a number of cases. It's always from an Anglo perspective. It's very, I think I've seen some letters in Hungarian that a pastor in Port Henry who helped out the Black immigrant community in the library at Port Henry, but he was a Protestant and the people he was helping were Catholic, and there was a huge divide between them. He was the first to describe when he talked about his experience. It's really tough because literacy itself presupposes an education and advantages that probably would have steered you out of the jobs that immigrants were taking who were unskilled in their first years here, and what was available to the person who could write. So that's the problem.
So I wonder if there are sort of inductive proxies. For instance, the folk song collections of Marjorie Lansing Porter. Some we may not have listened to those carefully for the immigrant experience. We may
I don't
have
think
listened-
anybody's listened to anything she's done nearly hard enough.
Oh,
I
well-
think she's a great hero of Adirondack social history.
I agree. My
Yeah.
experience with her, though, or with her recordings, is I have never listened to them for that particular experience. I've
Right.
listened to them for histories of logging and the various traditions that she was able to preserve through those.
Yeah.
But I don't know if anyone has ever tried to listen to them for what did it feel like to be a French-Canadian immigrant.
Yeah.
Those kinds of experiences, which is what archaeologists say, it's worth preserving data because you may have questions that no one thought to ask 40 years ago, and perhaps those collections of folk songs and perhaps folk art contain clues that if a scholar that you were mentoring might be able to go back and
Yeah.
listen to those. And
Well,
look
she's
at
a
those.
great example. This is a wonderful, the daughter or granddaughter of a great North Country public servant and historian, Wendell Lansing. Did you know they were related?
I did. I knew because
An
he had the
abolitionist
Essex County
also.
Republic. They own the Essex County Republican, which is
Right.
a great Whig newspaper
Yeah.
in the North Country.
And she's of that family, and she really dedicated her life to Adirondack history. She was the Essex County historian and a terrific recorder of her findings, and I just think so much work could be done on her work. It's painful to think that it hasn't been at this point.
Well, it may have been.
Yeah, there are a number of great Adirondack lay self-taught historians who haven't gotten any credit or love. It's time they felt the love, but that's up to us. We're going to have to take care of that. Someone else? Yeah.
You mentioned the Ku Klux Klan. Were you referring to the problem in Malone where they hired a lot of African Americans and then decided they didn't? I think it was probably for Alcoa. They decided they did
I
not
remember
want
that.
them in their town.
No, I wasn't referring to that. I wasn't. Was the Klan involved in that, in their sort of
Well,
expulsion?
I can't remember all. It was a talk that I listened to.
Yeah.
And it was a woman who gave the talk, and they documented where people were kicked out of their boarding houses, families were evicted, and there was a threat of the Ku Klux Klan, but I can't remember if they actually were there, but it was imminent if people did not leave after people were invited. And this was, not that long ago, 20s, 30s, 40s.
Well, that was the heyday of the Klan.
Yeah.
And especially in the North Country. That was its strong point. And that was in the Adirondacks, the Klan activities were largely directed against Irish Catholics. But they would have been directed at black people where they were in force in the population. Malone would be one of those places.
Yeah, yeah.
But at the time, in the 20s, there were hardly any black farmers left who stayed with Garrett Smith's land
enough,
giveaway.
have you been to the Underground Railroad Center in Albany, in Livingston Street? It's Harriet and
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the
They-
Myers family. Yeah.
they are, I think today, having a field trip up to John Brown.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I think they probably do that several times a year.
Yeah. And the other comment I want to make, you're talking about the people nowadays that were uncomfortable. I had to look it up. In Lake Placid, Nicole Houghton Patterson, they wrote on the
Yeah.
graffiti.
Yeah, she was the diversity
Yeah.
chief, the director of diversity issues in that town.
That was in 2000. So.
Yeah, and she wound up leaving the region. I think that made her so uncomfortable. I know, that was rough. That was a terrible thing, and I don't
I think
get
I've
the
allowed
feeling
enough
they ever caught whoever did that, nor do I know that that person was pursued with great avidity. I'd be surprised. But yeah, the good news about it was it did draw attention to the problem of racism in beautiful sunny Lake Placid and made that town sort of sit up and say, what can we do better? And I think that's the hopeful outcome of something like that. But that was horrible for her. Yeah. Someone else. Yeah. Thank you.
From the perspective of Native Americans, I don't know if you've ever heard of the book Black Dawn, Bright Day.
No.
It's an excellent book,
Yeah.
and it's from the perspective of how Native Americans viewed the white coming to America. It is excellent. It
Okay.
lays out their perspective of the shapes of the houses, how people thought, their armed, and then how the Native Americans were attached to the environment. As very, very predictive. Sun Bear writes it. It's excellent. It was written in the 90s, I think.
Okay.
And it's I was just interested in how much of perspective from the Native Americans who were here when white men came in, or white people. Is there anything in the annals or their history that records any of this?
I am the worst person to ask about this. I completely dropped the ball exploring the Native history that preceded the history I described in my book. Obviously, there were tribal communities and Native families in the North Elba region, but I had a big blind spot. It didn't occur to me for
It's just amazing.
year.
Because, the history of the schools that
Yeah.
were, the kids were taken off the reservations and they were put into schools.
that was a Midwestern thing. I don't think it affected natives in the Adirondack region.
sort of.
Yeah.
But actually, it was suggested by Henry Knox.
Oh,
He was
really?
the one that actually suggested that they take care of these savages.
Yeah.
So, there's just, when you read all the background on everybody, it's just really amazing. But they really have a perspective
Yeah.
on us.
I think Kurt Steger might be a better resource on the Native American Story in the Adirondacks. He's done a good deal of
He's
homework
in
on that.
Saratoga. Is he the one in Saratoga?
No,
or the-
he's up in,
New Paltz?
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And he's working with someone who's even more of an authority than he is. That's right. Is he alive or?
Yeah.
So, okay, so it's his father who passed.
Yes.
And Dave Fadden is the guy really to talk to if you want to pursue this. He's a real authority on Adirondack Native history.
And the University of Toronto scholar who did rural indigenous. which is
Oh,
also
that's a good book.
authoritative
Yeah,
text.
but I can't think of her name.
Neither can I.
Okay. Yeah. Look up the book Rural Indigenous. It's a really good book. It's
We do have, this Wednesday, we will have Tom Porter from the Mohawk Nation. He will be here, so if anybody, he might be able to answer some questions.
and
like
what's he
this.
going to talk about?
Haudenosaunee Worldview is the
Okay.
official title.
That would be great.
Yeah,
Huh.
Tom Porter.
I don't think I answered your question at all, but what can I say?
I also was curious about, from a woman's perspective, how much of this was impacted. We talk about the men and the families, but I don't know if you found any information on how women suffered, because I think they probably suffered more.
You're just hitting all the soft spots. You're going
I'm-
for the,
I'm just-
it's a real problem. I could not find any documentation from a woman's point of view for anything to do with the Black community I wrote about. The only women's perspectives I found were represented by the writers in John Brown's family. A number of the daughters and his wife wrote letters, and they wrote about how the Black community was doing and how their neighbors were faring. And they are the resource for the women's point of view in that community at the time. But that archive has only been saved because of the celebrity of John Brown. How many more are buried in local archives and stacks that we don't know about that would reveal a world about pioneer experience? And were the women taught to read and write at the time we want to know about? I'm guessing not. It would be really, I mean, John Brown was exceptional in insisting all his kids learn how to read and write. So that's a problem. Literacy is really it's a big black curtain that drops down between us and the history. And
It's a huge problem right now in the United States is people being able to read.
yeah. So
Huge
imagine
in our
it in the
schools.
mid 1800s, late
Yeah.
1800s, how tough it, and for immigrants in the turn of the century. Well, I think I've kept you long enough. Unless there's a last one lingering, okay. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.